Hey everyone, it's Politics with Amy Walter from The Takeaway. We're coming to you from WNYC's The Green Space in front of a live studio audience. Yay! We wish you were here. Sorry you're not, but we're thinking of you. We're here to celebrate the first anniversary of the show, and I was hoping they'd do this after my first 100 days, but apparently that's not how it works in radio. Very cheesy and good. Okay, when we launched the show in the summer of 2018, my mission seemed pretty simple: bring some perspective and context to politics because, let's face it, there's not a lot of it out there. I also wanted the show to be ahead of the curve, challenging conventional wisdom and identifying trends and topics early before they've been chewed over by cable TV news panels. Like our very first show where we explored the idea that 2018 could be the year of the woman.
I had never experienced people doubting my abilities, doubting my professionalism, doubting my qualification based on being a woman. Now, I've certainly experienced my share of racism in this country, but the sexism and misogyny was not something that I was expecting. And so when I first encountered it on the campaign, I didn't know what it was.
That's the voice of Lauren Underwood. When we talked to her, she was an underdog candidate running in a suburban Chicago district. Now she's Representative Underwood. She was one of a record-breaking 117 women elected or appointed to Congress, bringing the total number of women in the House and Senate to 127. And elections aside, it's been a big year in politics, and we've talked to a lot of people.
Eric Holder,
Nira Tandon,
Scott Walker,
Stacey Abrams, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you.
Chuck Hagel,
Gary Trudeau,
Susan Rice,
Andy Carr,
Kathleen Sebelius,
Carl Rove.
This is John Kerry.
My name is Julian Castro.
Jay Inslee, Governor of the State of Washington.
Bill Weld, former governor of Massachusetts.
Senator Booker.
I'm so grateful for this conversation. Thank you so much.
You get the picture. Anyway, it's been a great year, and we've really enjoyed it, and we're happy you've been along on the ride with us. And we're going to keep going. Right? Right. All right. Now we're going to get down to business. We've got a lot of work to do this morning, because today we're here to talk about the Electoral College. Now, lots of Democratic candidates, you heard them in the open, want to get rid of it, arguing it's an outdated relic that gives outsized weight to a narrow group of voters in just a handful of states. Many Republicans grumble, though, that the Democratic calls to scrap the system are just sour grapes. And a lot of smaller state officials worry it would limit their influence. So to kick things off, I'm joined by New York Times columnist and CBS News political analyst Jamelle Bouie, who, yes, excellent, who would like to see the Electoral College abolished, and Lina Newton, who's an associate professor of political science at Hunter College, who thinks it's all a bit more complicated. Jamelle and Lina, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So, Jamelle, I'm going to start with you. A headline on one of your New York Times columns said that the Electoral College is the biggest threat to our democracy, which is a pretty big claim.
It's a very big claim.
Yes. So why is that?
I think, so to support that claim, I think one of the problems looking ahead for the Electoral College is that the distribution of the population is such that more and more Americans are going to be in fewer and fewer states. And so the prospect of the kind of misfires we had in 2016 and 2000 of the winning candidate of the election, the person who becomes president, losing the national popular vote by larger and larger margins, I think actually is a very significant stress on people's belief in the legitimacy in the system. And it's something that even if you think the Electoral College should be preserved, should be at the forefront of your mind of how to diffuse that stress. But I think my larger argument for getting rid of, or at least significantly modifying the Electoral College, it's just that it's sort of out of alignment with the logic of our electoral system and the logic of the presidency itself. Americans understand the presidency to represent the broad American public. The president isn't at least how we see it, isn't elected by 50 separate states. As we understand it, as we talk about it, as the president talks about himself, the president is the elected representative of the people's representative vis-a-vis the other branches of government. And so it's sort of just conceptually strange to have a people's representative elected by this sort of this kludgy method of states doing electors and so on and so forth. The misfires is a practical problem. And then there's, I think, the issue that the Electoral College that we have isn't the one that the founders actually designed, right? The framers of the Constitution designed the system that the white landowners in the state acting on behalf of the people that they had influence over would gather together, cast votes for electors. The electors would kind of filter through candidates. The candidates, maybe one would win a majority of electors and that person become president. The framers weren't sure that ever happened, and so it would go to Congress, the House of Representatives, that would then cast a ballot and choose the president. It was supposed to be this a filtering mechanism, given the fact that the country was large, that it might be hard to find people who could be president, and this is how you would do it. This works twice, in 1792, or 1788 and 1792 with George Washington, and then it promptly fell apart in 1796 and in 1800. And since 1800, we've kind of just been finding ways to make sure the Electoral College doesn't violate the will of the voters in some dramatic way. And it seems to me that we should just go the full hog and say, we understand the president to be elected by the people. We understand the popular vote really to be the thing that confers legitimacy upon presidents. And so why not just do that instead and not have this thing that hasn't really worked as designed since its inception? And the people who designed it, like Madison, were by the end of his life was like, this isn't really going to work given what we're doing with it.
Lina, you teach about this, and you hear these things a lot that Jamelle raised about why it's not working. Can you give us a reason why it is working, or reasons why it is working, and what it would mean to not have it?
Sure. So, I mean, getting back to this idea, that it's this kind of strange institution, that's the first thing that comes across when I talk to students about it. It's not just why do we have it, but what is this weird thing? Who are these electors? It's, kind of this black box for them. So the way I come at this question is a bit differently, just kind of thinking about both the issues that Jamelle raised about representation and legitimacy. Those are the two big underlying issues that matter here. And the question is whether or not changing the Electoral College or getting rid of it altogether would address those fundamental issues of legitimacy, where you don't want, ideally, a mismatch between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. And to your question about, what's a good reason for keeping it, by and large, on the whole, the Electoral College has actually magnified the popular vote many times, including in 2008 and 2012. And so even in the recent era, even though it's, kind of this messy thing, it in some ways has granted more legitimacy to a president, even though the possibility exists is in 2000 and 2016 that the winner of the popular vote does not receive the majority of Electoral College votes. And so the question is do we just focus, are we at the point where we can take a couple of elections within our lifetime and say, okay, let's jettison a system that for, several hundred years or dozens of years has served us fairly well and provided both the legitimacy that we need and the feeling of representation of both minority interests and majority interests.
Well, and that goes to the heart, and I know a lot of the discussion that you've had, Jamelle, is what the intent of the founders was in doing this. Now, what we learned in school, or at least at basic civics, was, well, this is to protect these smaller states, right? We don't want a tyranny of the majority, and that if we do not have an electoral college, then it's California and Texas are going to elect every president, and New Mexico and New Hampshire, they will have no say.
Right. I mean, to me at least, one of the interesting things about at least the argument from framers' intent is that the first few presidents of the United States were all Virginians. Virginia at the time was the largest state. It was the California of early America.
Well, we're Virginians.
Love Virginia,
okay
great
with
state.
Virginia.
Rep the Commonwealth, wahoo wah. But the sort of the concern in terms of big states, small states at the time wasn't really big states, small states. It was population of people who could actually vote in each state. And so in Virginia and in North Carolina and in Maryland and in South Carolina, those were large population states. The problem for the framers from those states is that half their populations were enslaved people. And so a direct popular vote might be fair, and several of them thought it was probably the most fair way. But if you wanted a Virginian or a North Carolinian or someone from the South to be able to ascend to the presidency, given the mismatch in freeborn population between the North and the South, that was going to be a problem. That's not to say that the Electoral College was created solely to protect the interests of slaveholders. I think that's actually something you can dispute, but that was a practical thing. That's a practical consideration for the framers. I think in the present, I'm not sure, just on a kind of logistical matter, I'm not sure there's really a big state domination problem if you were to move to a popular vote, right? Like, if you look at the 2016 numbers, you would have to have kind of every single person in California who can vote for one candidate for it to have that kind of impact. You'd have to have sort of uniform support among voters in states like New York and Texas. And I think the thing that Electoral College maps maybe mislead the public in the thinking is these states aren't monolithic. 4 million Californians live in rural places, and those are heavily Republican places. There are more rural voters in California than in, say, Wyoming and Montana and sort of states we recognize as rural. That if you're looking at the United States as a map of populations and not a map of states, then the electoral picture actually looks very different. You could imagine, for example, a situation where a Democratic candidate is spending a lot of time campaigning in the Deep South. Why? Because in most of those states, 30 to 35, 40% of the voters are Democrats, are going to vote for Democrats, and their turnout is quite low because in the presidential election, they effectively don't matter. That if all of a sudden there is an incentive for Democrats to go to the Deep South, for Republicans to spend time in California or New England, for everyone to kind of go towards the demographics, the sectors, the regions of the country where their voters exist, and their voters exist everywhere, then I think the representation problem kind of solves itself.
Although, and Lina, we have a little bit less than a minute, then we're going to come back. But would this then just exacerbate what we already have as a rural-urban divide? If indeed, then it's not about states, but it's where do you live by density?
Right. It might be an issue by density, but there's also a deeper question about representation. Right now, the way we're discussing this is representation of the voting eligible population. And one of the things we tend to forget is when it comes to the Electoral College, it counts population, regardless of citizenship, regardless of age, regardless of their status, their eligibility to vote, and having registered to vote. And those people right now are counted for the purposes of representation in the Electoral College. And if we get rid of the Electoral College, we have to be willing to understand that there are people who will lose representation as a result of not being able to vote.
We have to take a quick break. More with Jamelle Bouie and Lina Newton in just a minute. And we're back. Politics with Amy Walter, broadcasting live today from WNYC's The Green Space. It's really cool. If you're just tuning in, we're debating the Electoral College. I'm here with Jamelle Bouie, columnist for the New York Times and a CBS News political analyst, and Lina Newton, an associate professor of political science at Hunter College. Lina, I want to continue with the point you finished on about, the fact that states are given their representatives in Congress based on their total population, not just who's eligible to vote. Right. So one of the consequences then, that's a consequence potentially, is that these states that are really big may not have as many representatives. Right, ultimately, California may not have 53 congressional districts if they counted that differently or not have the same influence.
Same with New York, right? These are two states that are not only large, but have large immigrant populations, have large minority populations. And the reason it matters that it's minority populations is minority populations on the whole tend to skew younger. And so you have larger segments of the minority population that wouldn't be voter eligible because they don't meet the age requirement, that do receive at least some representation via the Electoral College. And so it's just being wary and being understanding of the fact that jettisoning the Electoral College could have real consequences even for representation, because we have to think about what facet of representation we value most. And in Congress, at least the way it's been set up, the reason we have by population is understanding that there are interests, that need to be represented regardless of voting status.
So let's go to a potential solution for this. So, Jamelle, there are a couple of ways to deal with jettisoning the Electoral College. One is a constitutional amendment. Can we agree that that's impossible?
Not
Probably not
likely.
gonna
Okay.
happen.
All right. So there we go. That was easy. Now we'll go to something that has been around for, I think it's been at least 10 years, maybe a little bit more, something that's called the National Popular Vote Compact. We have 14 states and D.C. that have pledged to give their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. The compact is still 81 votes short of 270. Just yesterday, in time for our show, which was, thank you for this, news people, news gods, the Democratic governor of Nevada vetoed their popular vote compact bill, saying he was worried that it would lessen the influence of a small state like Nevada, which obviously has been a battleground state,
Right.
both in the primaries and in the general election. So do you want to talk a little bit, Jamelle, about what could work? Do you think that the popular vote compact is really the best way to go? Is that likely to happen? Or there's some sort of compromise between constitutional amendment, this popular vote, and something else?
I think in terms of circumventing the Electoral College, the compact is probably the best option on the table. States have sort of complete authority to choose and allocate their electors as they fit. In the first election, some electors were chosen. The first presidential election, some electors were just chosen by gubernatorial appointment, for example. There's no rule about how you do this. And so if you could get 200 states equal to 270 electoral votes to just agree that whoever wins a popular vote is going to get their votes, that is kind of the ball game. But I think given that we're 10 years in and still a ways from that, I think that if it even happens will be sometime in the future. For me, and since my paramount concern is I think that these misfires are going to get worse. I think all the demographic and population trends of the country suggest that if in 2016 it was a difference of 2.9 million votes, in 2020 it could be a difference if the president wins re-election and if his support continues to stay as low as it does, but it continues to stay fairly high in the key electoral states, it could be a 4 million vote difference, right? Like, at what point does a misfire threaten to undermine the legitimacy of everything? At what point do Americans say to themselves, listen, in every single election I vote in, whoever wins the most votes wins. But in this one election that is extremely important and given a polarized and highly partisan country, very consequential, my vote seems to matter less and less. And that is just not good for the stability of a system. So if that's the concern, I do think there are ways short of abolishing the Electoral College that can mitigate it, can make misfires less likely. The first and most immediate one is just to end winner take all for Electoral College votes, right? That Electoral College votes are distributed on a proportional level. So if you win 45% of Texas's vote, you get 45% of its electors. And that, at least, I think seems just more, for me, seems more fair on the face of it. The fact that winning a narrow majority in a place like Texas or Georgia gets you, or California, not California, but Florida gets you all that state's Electoral College votes, I think renders that substantial population that didn't vote for the candidate kind of irrelevant. And it also would just reduce the odds of misfires. And I really think we should take these misfires much more seriously. They do kind of stress the political system a ton. If presidents who won with the minority popular vote then govern in sort of a consensus-based manner, it might not be as bad, but they aren't.
But there's no guarantee.
Yes, and to that point, if you had a popular vote, you could have 7 candidates running, a candidate wins 36% of the popular vote. Is that any better?
Right, and then that's the issue, is how do you then determine who a winner is? Is it the person who wins a plurality? What is that minimum threshold for the plurality. And there's the bigger issue, too, getting back to this big issue of legitimacy. What happens if we get rid of the Electoral College? We tend to forget that our elections are not just 50 different electoral systems, but they're actually municipal systems, county-level systems. I mean, across New York, you don't see the same voting machines from one county to the next. So what happens when you get rid of the Electoral College, which keeps everything kind of geographically bounded, and now it's open to a popular vote? And now the vote outtake is very, very narrow. Now you have candidates who are challenging the outcomes in 100 municipalities. Right. And then those go to the courts, and the courts are having their own legitimacy issues. It could potentially be very destabilizing. It's not this clear majority will win if we move to a popular
Lina,
vote.
thank you. This
you.
was great conversation. We're going to have a little bit more with them. I'm going to say goodbye for right now to Jamelle Bouie, the New York Times columnist, Lina Newton, Associate Professor of Political Science at Hunter College. We're going to come back. They're going to answer some of your questions at the end of the show. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. It's Politics with Amy Walter from The Takeaway. We are back with Lina Newton and Jamelle Bouie talking about the Electoral College. We're here live at the Green Space on WNYC. Jamelle and Lina were with us at the top of the show, and I wanted to bring them back to answer some questions my producers collected from the audience here as they were coming in. We have one question from John Paul in the audience who asks, and I'm going to start with you, Jamelle. Do you think addressing the Electoral College issue would be a tipping point to address Senate representation? Again, the idea that these less populated states get equal representation to more populated states.
Right. I think if your complaint with the entire election system is simply the overrepresentation of less populated areas, then
somebody says yes.
Yeah, that's my complaint. Then the logic of sort of like addressing the Electoral College like leads naturally to addressing the Senate, especially since in the Senate, as designed, and you have a sort of a similar issue there. The Senate as designed, voters didn't directly elect senators. State representatives elected senators. In a real sense, the senators represented the interests of the state lawmakers. But since the direct election of senators, after the 17th Amendment, 16th Amendment, that kind of the senators now kind of directly represent the people of the state, and it's not a very short jump from there to, well, why have a Senate that is still based on equal representation of states? So that's if your complaint is just overrepresentation of sparsely populated areas. But if your complaint is just that, and this is mine, that it's fine that we have a House that kind of represents people and places. It's fine that we have a Senate that represents states, but it doesn't really make sense to have a presidency that also, in some sense, represents states. If the presidency is conceived of and thought of as representing the people, then I don't think there's necessarily a connection between getting rid of the Electoral College or significantly reforming it and getting rid of the Senate. Although I know quite a few progressives see the Senate as sort of an intractable obstacle to progressive policy, would like to see some sort of substantial, significant Senate reform.
And Lina, you teach this issue. I'm curious if you can help us understand the changes that we did make to electing the Senate and going from the legislature electing the Senate to direct representation. We did that at the turn of the 20th century. How did that come across? And given that we've made significant changes to the Constitution before, how could we do something like that again?
Sure. So that's a terrific question, because I think that's the biggest analogy that's often made is, we have a direct election of the senators now. Doesn't it make sense then to have direct election of the president, because it is a national office? And the 17th Amendment came about. It was actually part of general progressive reforms that were going on at the state and local level, and that wended their way into these national offices of the Senate to make the senators more bound to their state constituencies rather than their state legislatures. But it was multi-partisan. All the major parties agreed with it. It was multi-state. And so there was kind of this groundswell of opinion and agreement. And interestingly, it was a case in which you had both labor interests and rural interests, farming interests, aligned in favor of this change. And what we don't see right now is a consensus. Right now, this is along party lines, as Carrie was discussing earlier.
Right. And party lines increasingly are defined by regional
Regional,
rights,
right.
whether you're rural or
Right,
urban.
there's a lot of overlap.
Margaret in the audience wants to know if the Electoral College would be talking about this issue if Donald Trump hadn't won. Jamelle?
I mean, I'm the kind of person who has lots of ideas about institutional reform, so I would be talking about it. I think in terms of like the popular conversation, we wouldn't be talking about it had Donald Trump not won. I think we wouldn't be talking about it if Al Gore had won and then Donald Trump won. I think there's something about sort of a president, like one Electoral College misfire, and then very shortly thereafter a second one in such that short time is what makes it feel very acute to people, because that is quite unusual. That hasn't really happened before.
Lina, what do you think?
I tend to agree. My students are much more into it. I teach here in New York City, and so everybody wants to get rid of the Electoral College, of course. So this is very much a part of the conversation. And how is it? How is it that these two things don't match? And I often have to remind them, usually they do. Usually, again, in the case of two other recent elections, in 2012 and 2008, Barack Obama's 51 and 52% wins translated into 67.7% in 2008 of the Electoral College and 63% of the Electoral College in 2012. And that tends to be the norm, where there is kind of this legitimating majority that comes out of the Electoral College to then boost that kind of popular vote.
Well, and the other thing, Lina, that I think about all the time with the Electoral College, if you go back and you look at which presidential candidate won which states, you don't even have to go that far back.
Right.
When I first started in politics, California and New Jersey were swing states that Republicans had won, right? And that Democrats were winning in Georgia and Montana. Sure. So that it evolves. We're now talking about Arizona being a toss-up state, Georgia coming back into the mix, Virginia, Colorado. So do you buy, though, that over time, this works its way out because of the demographic and other changes where people are moving to?
Right. I think that's actually the strongest case for leaving things as they be. That electoral coalitions are not static; that they do change over time. That, as you said, we can see this change in very recent memory. I'd say that the concern, and I kind of touched on this on that first segment, is that having these sorts of misfires might be okay in a political universe where there is some degree of consensus around national problems, around national solutions, where there is some compromise, where the parties are pursuing their interests, certainly, but they're not engaging in sort of total political war. But if there is total political war, and that seems to be where we're trending, then it does become a big problem in terms of getting the country to move in one direction when I'm going to call them minority presidents govern that way.
All right. Jamelle Bouie is a columnist for the New York Times. Lina Newton is an associate professor of political science at Hunter College. Lina, Jamelle, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank our audience who joined us in studio today. You guys were awesome. To the Green Space for hosting us. I also want to thank my amazing team who helped make the show happen every week. Jake Howitt, Vince Fairchild, Ellen Frankman, David Gable, Amber Hall, Polly Irugu, Lydia Jean Cott, of course, the rest of the Takeaway crew who are in the audience today. Thank you so much for listening wherever you are through the magic of radio. This is Politics with Amy Walter from the Takeaway.